Well, greetings as always, and welcome back. You know, the Washington Post reports mass starvation stalks Gaza as deaths from hunger rise. Israel has severely limited the amount of food entering Gaza, where society is on the brink of collapse. Ever see something awful and tell yourself, someone else will handle it? That's the bystander effect. Which raises the question, why are Americans, for the most part, on one side of the equation standing by while humans are starved to death, and America as a country is complicit in the genocide, the collective punishment, the war crime? Well, let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. You know, with each show, my guests and I provide insight and analysis into current events and the broader historical context in which most of these events take place. I want to repeat something I said yesterday, and then we'll get right to my guest. Folks, Palestinians in Gaza are not starving. I repeat, that's just not true. They are not starving. Palestinians in Gaza are being starved to death. The operative term here is being. Palestinians in Gaza are being starved to death. The suffering that the world is witnessing is not the result of a natural catastrophe. This is not due to a multi-year drought or hordes of locusts descending on the region, decimating the agricultural base, thereby access to food. That's not what's happening in Gaza. In Gaza, there is food relief available. There is medical aid available, but it's rotting in trucks on the border, not being allowed into the country. People are not starving. A decision has been made to use food as a weapon to starve Palestinians into submission. It's Israel's final solution to its Palestinian problem. Decisions have been made by the likes of Benjamin Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, and the U.S. Congress to weaponize food and aid. People are being directed to a particular area, told that aid will be provided to them, and when they arrive, snipers shoot them in the head. There's a difference between starving and being starved. You can't negotiate with drought. You can't change the weather. You can't negotiate with locusts. You can change the conscious decision that the governments are making. You can stop the starvation by allowing people to be fed. On today's episode, the issue before us is, according to the Washington Post, after 4 months of a near total Israeli siege, Gaza's few remaining hospitals now have wards for the growing number of malnourished or starving children whose tiny bodies are just the width of their bones. Doctors are famished to the point that they have dizzy spells as they make their rounds, medics say, and the journalists documenting these caseloads are often too weak to even walk the clinics. Why as I asked in my open, starvation has become Israel's final solution to what they perceive to be their Palestinian problem. My guest is a lawyer, journalist, and activist, Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri, as always, man, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Dr. Leon. Pleasure to be here again.
Your thoughts to my open. Am I articulating a distinction without a difference, or is there a substantive difference between starving people and people being starved?
Oh, I think you nailed it. You formulated the question in the way it has to be questioned to highlight the fact that this is a human-made famine. This is the conscious decision of the Israeli government, and I want to underline this, backed by every major Western government. You're quite right to highlight the complicity of the U.S. government because it has done the most to enable and facilitate Israel's criminal behavior. But every major Western government, including the Canadian government, and I'm sitting here in Montreal, Canada today, has the blood of Palestinian children on their hands. And we have an obligation, you, me, every citizen of every Western country listening to this conversation today, aware of the facts, and we should all be aware now of what is being done to the Palestinian people. We have an obligation to stop the crimes being facilitated by our own governments. We put them in power. We pay the taxes that fund their operations. They speak in our name. The ultimate responsibility lies with each and every one of us. And like you, I am profoundly disappointed at how many people in our society are not standing up for the Palestinian people at the moment of this man-made Holocaust.
You know, one of the things that is I think, very easy to fall victim to would be, I'll call it the history of the current or the history of the present, as though this atrocity or these atrocities started October 7th last year. This has been an ongoing, very slow drip, drip, drip of starvation. The Israeli government has been calculating caloric intake in Gaza and in the West Bank for years. Access to potable water has been limited intentionally. Access to electricity this has been an ongoing drip, drip, drip of genocide for over 40 years. This did not just start but it's been exacerbated since October 7th, but it didn't start then.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point. Back, I'm trying to remember the exact year. I think it was 2015, 2016. The United Nations, I believe it was the Relief Works Agency, but it was some arm of the United Nations, issued a report which was widely publicized in the West that Gaza would be unlivable by 2020. The October 7th attacks happened, obviously, almost 4 years beyond the beginning of 2020. And in between the time that the UN warned of what would happen to Gaza by 2020, something of seminal importance happened in Gaza, and that is a thing called the Great March of Return, where Palestinian refugees, and there are hundreds of thousands of them living in Gaza, tried to exercise peacefully their right under international law to return to their homeland. They were walking up to the fence that was trapping them in this open-air concentration camp, carrying flags, unarmed women, children, disabled persons on wheelchairs were rolling up to the fence, and they were being gunned down mercilessly. This went on for over a year, and it was the subject of UN Commission inquiry, which found war crimes and crimes against humanity had been committed. One peaceful Palestinian refugees seeking to exercise their lawful right to return to their homeland was gunned down mercilessly, and the West did nothing about it. The message that the Palestinian people received at that moment was, okay, the UN warned that our concentration camp in which we are trapped is going to be unlivable by 2020. We tried to exercise peacefully our right to return to our homeland and break out of this concentration camp, and we were murdered en masse, and there was no accountability. What option is left to us but armed resistance? And that led directly to October 7th, 2023. And of course, there were also the Abraham Accords during the first Trump administration, which normalized relations between major Gulf autocracies and Israel's genocidal entity without any accommodation being made for the Palestinian right to self-determination. So all of this collectively together sent a loud and clear message to the Palestinians that their only alternative was armed resistance.
Mel W., thank you very much for that $4.99 super sticker. And Dimitri, you are an attorney, and we hear this bantied about almost ad nauseum, which is not to say it isn't significant. But talk about the importance of international law here and the Palestinians' right to self-defense. We hear all the time, oh, Israel has the right to defend itself. No, it doesn't. Not based upon international law. There's a reason that this space or these spaces are referred to internationally as the occupied territories. There's a reason they've been given that designation all around the world. And for many to refuse to use that term now does not negate the reality. Dimitri Lascaris.
So last year, there was a decision rendered by the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the United Nations system, the World Court, which was supported overwhelmingly by the 15 judges of the court, many of whom were from the West, that both Gaza and the West Bank, not just the West Bank, constitute occupied territory for purposes of international law, and moreover, that the occupation is illegal. And the court rendered an opinion that Israel had an obligation under international law to end the occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank as quickly as possible. Now, there has been this narrative, I just saw reports about this today, that, Hamas and the other Palestinian resistance groups are being unreasonable by demanding that Israeli forces withdraw from the Gaza Strip entirely. In fact, they have that right, as the UN's highest court ruled last year overwhelmingly, irrespective of any concessions they may be willing to make to Israel. Israel is supposed to withdraw. It should have already done it completely from the Gaza Strip. And the Western corporate media and Western governments are acting as if the resistance's demand that they withdraw is somehow unreasonable. No, that's their right. There's nothing more they need to do. They don't have any obligation to concede anything to Israel, not 1 inch of the Gaza Strip. Are they obliged to cede to Israel? This is the reality. And so Israel today, just by virtue of the fact that its troops are in the Gaza Strip, is violating international law. And in fact, the Palestinians are being extremely reasonable, because if they were demanding that all of their rights be satisfied as a condition of freeing these prisoners of war, which is what they are. They're soldiers who were taken in combat. They're prisoners of war. And if they were being demanding everything to which they're entitled under international law, they would not only be demanding that the Israelis withdraw from the Gaza Strip, they would be demanding, as a condition of freeing those prisoners of war, that Israel withdraw from the West Bank, and that Israel dismantle its settlements and force the 800,000 illegal settlers out of the West Bank, and that Israel give them a Palestinian state, a truly sovereign Palestinian state. They're not demanding any of those things, Wilmer. They're demanding much less than they are entitled to demand under international law, and yet the West is characterizing them as the unreasonable participants in this so-called negotiation.
And I'm glad you used the word sovereign, because we hear that term all the time, but a lot of people really don't understand the international definition of sovereignty, which is the internationally recognized ability to govern a defined geographic space and to use militaristic responses in order to do so. And so when you say sovereign and Palestinian in the same sentence, again, a lot of folks, so the West is saying Israel is demanding, oh, well, Hamas has been has used terrorism. And so now, we can't have a sovereign Palestinian space, let alone Palestinian state. But as soon as you use the word sovereign, you're talking about the ability to self-govern a defined geographic space, and the ability to use militaristic responses in order to do so.
Yes, back in, I think it was 2006, there was an election held in the occupied territories with the sanction of Israel, with the support and permission of Israel and the United States and other Western governments. And in the lead up to that election, Hamas said, we're entering the political process. We're not going to engage in any more kind of attacks on civilians, whom they regarded, as complicit, because they're, from the perspective of the resistance, they were all illegitimate colonials coming from Western countries, predominantly the indigenous land of Palestinians. So they forswore the use of violence to achieve their ends. They participated in the election. Hamas won the election clearly and by a significant margin. And what did the United States and other Western governments in Israel do? They crushed the democratic will of the Palestinian people. Furthermore, there has never been a point in time at which the Palestinians have been offered a truly sovereign state. The closest they came was about 20, 25 years ago. I believe it was when Clinton was in office. And as Noam Chomsky documented meticulously, what they were in fact offered was Bantustans, which is not in any meaningful sense of the word sovereign. The borders, they were intermingled amongst illegal Israeli settlements. The borders were going to be controlled by Israel, and they weren't permitted, the Palestinians, to have their own army, which any sovereign state is permitted to have. So there's never been a point in time, ever, when the Palestinian people were offered a truly sovereign state. And all they have done is, and frankly, Leon, if they were to accept the international consensus, which is a state along the 1967 borders, that would be an incredible deal for Israel, because that means that the Palestinian people, the people who are indigenous to this land, would end up about 20% of historic Palestine, and Israel would get the other 80%, the colonizers. And we are being told, we've been told this for decades, that their demand that they have all of the territory on the Palestinian side of the 1967 borders is unreasonable. In fact, that would be an incredible deal for Israel. Incredible. And Israel won't take it.
Well, it's an incredible deal if you're trying to find a balanced, equitable, peaceful, rational way out of this. But when you are an entity that is now turning to starvation as the final solution to your perceived Palestinian problem, there's no rational response. And that's why I've been asking this question for a very long time, as we hear about attempts at negotiating anything. And you're an attorney. I think you've engaged in a negotiation or two in your time. How do you negotiate with somebody who has committed publicly to your extermination? I don't understand how you can sit in a room across a table and negotiate with somebody that says, I'm here to see to it that you and the likes of you never walk the face of the earth again. Dimitri.
Yeah, I've been in dozens and dozens of negotiations involving high stakes complex litigation. And I could tell you that if the adversary of my client was behaving like Israel, there'd be no damn discussions. We'd say, we're going to go to, the litigation equivalent of war. We're going to trial and let the chips fall where they may. We have nothing to talk to you about. Okay.
As Sonny Corleone said in The Godfather, we're going to the mattresses.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And and the Palestinians are in a terrible place because they don't have an independent arbiter to adjudicate their claims, one that's capable of enforcing international law.
There you go.
So they engage in this process. I think they understand perfectly well that the game is rigged against them. They say that the Egyptians and the Qataris are mediators. What? The Egyptians and the Qataris are puppets of Washington. But what else are the Palestinians going to do? They have to engage in this process because they have no other alternative. There's no court that will both vindicate their rights and enforce its judgment against Israel. There's no government that is willing to intervene either by means of economic leverage or military force to save them. So they're doing what they're pursuing the only alternative they have. But I think they understand perfectly well that this is a rigged game.
And by my question, I wasn't trying to infer that they didn't. That was more a reflection of the international perspective. I mean, shoot, they understand it a hell of a lot better than I do.
Me too.
You made mention to the indigenous rights to this land, and Peggy Parks Miller says the Balfour Declaration was a disgrace. Because I've gotten, in terms of my radio show, I get a number of people calling and saying, well, Wilmer, what about the Balfour Declaration? And I say, well, have you ever read it? And usually the answer is no. And when I start reading the Balfour Declaration, folks come to understand, to Peggy's point, it's a disgrace. Dimitri.
Britain was a colonial power, up until in the years leading up to the Declaration of Independence by the Zionist entity in, I think, 1948. And it was effectively a trustee. Its obligation in the years leading up to the creation of Israel was to act as a trustee, and the international community allocated, and even this was unjust. The United Nations adopted a resolution in the days leading up to the Declaration of Israeli Independence, which allocated something like 40% of the land of historic Palestine to the Palestinians, who occupied at that point a significant majority of the population of historic Palestine. So that was a very good and unfair deal to the Palestinians. The Israelis, after declaring independence, rejected it. Said, no, we're not going to be satisfied with 60%. We want more. And so they took more, and they they orchestrated something that's come to be known as the Nakba, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled from their land forcibly, and their descendants to this very day are living in exile all around the world, particularly in other countries of West Asia. So what effectively the British did through the Balfour Declaration is they promised to colonials, people who were coming from Europe and fleeing the monstrosities that had been visited upon the Jewish people by Europeans, not by Arabs. Okay, they promised to them land that belonged to somebody else. Now, why did they do this? I think it's quite clear why they did this. The British and the Americans and their military planners in the aftermath of World War II described West Asia as the greatest material prize in human history and the source of stupendous strategic power because of its location as a nexus between Europe, Asia, and Africa, and because of its fossil fuel resources, its trade routes. And the fact is, if you want to be the dominant power in the world today, you have to control West Asia. And so they cynically exploited, this is what the British did through the Balfour Declaration, they cynically exploited the horrific plight of the Jewish people, which the Europeans created in order to establish a beachhead in the heart of this strategically important region. And to this very day, that is, as I've said many times, the way to conceive of Israel is it's a giant US British military base in the heart of the world's richest oil producing region. That's what it is. It is not a real country. It's a military base masquerading as a country.
Who was it that said, Alexander Hague called it the America's largest unsinkable aircraft carrier in the region. And folks, I think, need to understand the significance of that reference.
And by the way, the aircraft carrier is sinking, but that's another question which we can get into if you want.
Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
There's so many indicators of Israel's imminent collapse. There was a report that just came out that less than 60% of reservists are showing up for duty. There in the last, and I could go on and on about this. I'm just going to try to give you some sort of significant insights into what's going on from my perspective. In the last 2 weeks, there were 5 suicides amongst Israeli soldiers. The Knesset, members of the Knesset are demanding suicide data from the Israeli military. It's refusing to give the data to members of the Knesset. There was a report today that a 70-year-old woman, someone who's in her 70s, planned to take Netanyahu down with her. This is a Jewish Israeli member of Israeli society, and apparently she was going to do it with an RPG. There are massive protests in the streets. The country is reeling from the economic damage, particularly from the 12-day war with Iran. So Alexander Hague,
Wait a minute. Folks, a lot of folks don't really understand. Israel got hammered by Iran. And that reality has changed the mindset of a lot of Israelis living in that space.
Absolutely. One of the in my program, Reason to Resist, one of the reports that I did in the last 12 months was to go to Cyprus and to explore the massive influx of Israelis into that island in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I am told by sources, there was a lot of interesting information that came out in the course of my going to places like Paphos and Limassol and Latanika on the southern coast of Cyprus, the Akrotiri military base, about just how many Israelis were flooding into Cyprus. As one, local newspaper put it, they were buying up everything in sight. I spend a good deal of my time in Greece. I'm a citizen of that country. There are a tremendous number of Israelis coming into Greece now and trying to establish a presence there. And I'm told by people in Cyprus that since I did their report last year, the situation has gotten much worse. And they're now openly discussing amongst the Cypriot politicians, the Greek Cypriot politicians, if they're at risk of losing their identity because so many Israelis are coming into their country and are buying things up. And by the way, making things unaffordable for Cypriots. So there was also a report done by some Israeli economists that if something in the range of 10% of the employees, the most qualified employees in Israel's high-tech sector left the country, that would basically plunge Israel into an economic death spiral. In terms of the 12-day war, we know that that the Iranians were able to strike the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, the largest oil refinery in Israel, and there are only two of them. It was situated in Haifa. They struck Mossad headquarters. They struck 5 or 6 Israeli military bases. They struck the Weizmann Institute, which is the technological backbone of the Israeli military. They struck industrial facilities of military contractors. And this is what we know. And in the space of 12 days, Wilmer, this is why the Israelis went hat in hand to the Trump administration and said, get us out of this mess. And what I think is most telling is that, whereas Israel systematically will violate immediately any ceasefire agreement it enters into, this is what it did, for example, in the case of Lebanon. Last year it entered into a ceasefire agreement with Lebanon, and immediately the next day it started bombing Lebanon, just using the ceasefire agreement as toilet paper. It hasn't done that to Iran. There has been no reported attack by Israel's military on the sovereign territory of Iran since that ceasefire came into effect. They're very worried, and they're trying desperately to hide their anxiety from the population in Israel for fear that there will be a massive exodus.
And also, Israel used F-35s only to find out that they're not as stealthy as advertised, which is why they were only able to fly them up to the Israeli airspace. They couldn't enter Iranian. They couldn't enter Iranian airspace because these stealthy, invisible fighters were picked up on radar.
Yeah, to this very day, as others have pointed out, there's not a single video of an Israeli warplane flying over the airspace of Iran during these 12 days. That'll tell you a lot. I was in South Lebanon 5 times in the last 2 years, and I could tell you I could produce plenty of videos of Israeli warplanes flying overhead, which they do with impunity in Lebanese airspace. So if they were actually given, free rein to operate in Iranian airspace, the Israelis, there would be plenty of videos to back this up. There's not a single one.
And to Zhao Yun's point, F-35s are very stealthy. Yeah, until they're detected by radar. That's why they're called the flying piano. Their nickname is, I think, the flying piano. Not only are they not stealthy, Zhao Yun, not only are they not stealthy, well, until they're picked up on radar, they can't fly in storms because, I mean, these things are just garbage.
And they're insanely expensive. That's the thing that's mind-blowing.
You meant, and you talked about the targets that the Iranian government struck. And this is evidence of how strategic Iran is, how patient Iran is, and how what's the word I'm looking for? Well, strategic and patient they are. And a lot of people have been misinterpreting Iran's strategy with fear.
Well, Iran is, I think,
reserved. That's the word I've been looking for. How reserved Iran has been and continues to be.
And we saw this in 2021, I believe it was, at the dying days of the first Trump administration, when they assassinated Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani. The Iranians were incredibly restrained.
Mm-hmm.
And I've often asked myself that question as well. They are clearly capable of inflicting devastating damage on Israel, and they've taken so much abuse. If you try to think about it objectively, if you were in the position of a leader of Iran and you knew that you were dealing with a rabid dog, which is what Israel is, it's, the West's rabid attack dog, and they have nukes and they're capable of any atrocity, the wise course of action would be to escalate against them only in response to provocations and with great reservation, as you put it. I think they're trying to avoid being nuked, but even quite apart from the nuclear capacity of Israel and the United States, they have enough conventional weaponry to inflict considerable damage on the civilian population of Iran. And so they're going up the escalation ladder very gingerly, the Iranians, and it's understandable.
It's also understandable. I think people need to understand the difference between an aggressor / occupier and a resistance movement. Hamas is a resistance movement. Iran is operating from the mindset of a resistance movement. And so the strategies and the objectives of a resistance movement are different than those of a colonizer, those of an aggressor. Dimitri.
It's especially when you're massively outgunned. So they've opted to pursue a war of attrition, which, by the way, is not unlike the decision Russia's taken. Although Russia's much more potent military force than the axis of resistance, nonetheless, it is going up against the collective military might and economic resources of the West. So they too have opted for a war of attrition. And one of the things that people, don't like to talk about in the West is the balance of resolve. The people, I've been there enough, and I've interacted enough with Palestinians, Lebanese, Iranians, Yemenis to know that they are capable of taking far more casualties than are the Israelis. I like to refer to Israeli soldiers as latte-slipping, gun-toting terrorists, because that's what they are. It's very easy, as many people who are outraged by what is happening have said, to kill defenseless women and children and elderly men and block humanitarian aid from going in. It's another thing altogether to take massive casualties. And this is something to which the indigenous peoples of West Asia have become accustomed, sadly and tragically. And they're much more determined than Israel, I think, to win this fight. So they've opted for a strategy of attrition. And over time, I think the balance of resolve will result in them emerging as victorious. Unfortunately, sadly, horribly, in the interim, until that happens, the West can and will inflict horrible casualties on the peoples of the region, as we have seen.
I have been trying to decide if I was going to respond to these two comments or just let them go, but I think I need to respond to them because I think it's always important to draw this distinction. The priest of Hiroshima says Israel is the synagogue of Satan. Kevin Baptist responds, "Stop insulting Satan, LOL." When priest of Hiroshima uses Israel and synagogue in this context, I think it's important to draw the distinction between Judaism and or this anti-Semitism and shoot, now I'm drawing a blank on the word. Zionism. It's always important to draw the distinction between Zionism and Judaism because the two are not the same. And so I want to make that point in your thoughts to that point, Dimitri.
Well, I completely agree with you. And the problem that people like you and I have, and so many others who make this point, is that our adversaries in this struggle are constantly referring to Israel as the Jewish state. And they're constantly conflating Zionism with Judaism. And so we have to, be ever diligent to point out that they are wrong. And what makes it particularly difficult to make that case is that it's not just, Israel and the supporters of Israel in the Jewish community who call Israel the Jewish state. It's the political elites. It's non-Jewish Zionists who are leading. Look, in Canada, the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, just before he left office, he was describing Israel as the Jewish state. The corporate media describes Israel as the Jewish state. So there's this huge propaganda machine conflating wrongly, shamelessly, Judaism with Zionism. And so we have, a tremendous amount of work to do to counteract that. And it's becoming increasingly difficult, I have to say.
Kevin Baptist, thank you for that $10 super sticker. And he says, yo, Dimitri, the other day you said that the U.S. is trapped between fear and hubris, which is a fact. So is Israel. Keep up the good work, man. And the question, how is Laith doing? Laith is doing well. I'll answer it from my side, and then Dimitri, you can answer that question from your side. He's doing well, and there will be a statement released. He's working through legal issues, which, of course, when you've been abducted for 3 days by the state, there are legal issues that have to be worked through. He's working through those legal issues. Your answer, Dimitri.
Yeah, he got out Tuesday night. It was about 3 days he was in detention. And, as a lawyer, I completely understand his reticence to speak publicly. He's in he needs to choose his words carefully. And there may be restrictions on what he can say because he was being interrogated by Lebanese military intelligence. And I understand from speaking to people in Lebanon that the Lebanese military intelligence is not really subject to the requirements of due process. So he said,
neither is American.
True.
We don't give a damn about the due process clause either.
Yeah, but at least they pretend to. So whereas in Lebanon,
not anymore.
Actually, that's a good point. So I think we'll be hearing from Leith soon, but I completely understand his desire to consult with his counsel.
Yeah, he Leith is a very wise man. One of the things that I found interesting, as I've watched MSNBC and CNN this week, the overwhelming amount of focus of the news has been on Jeffrey Epstein. It hasn't been on starvation in Gaza. It hasn't been on the plight of the Palestinians, snipers shooting children at aid posts. There's been the news day is consumed by Jeffrey Epstein, and you mentioned Mossad, and many believe that he was actually a Mossad agent, and there is evidence to that effect. But the news cycle give your thoughts on the power of the narrative, and because you were just talking about how we have to work on always articulating the distinction between Zionism and Judaism, but the narrative and the news cycle contributes greatly to that problem.
This thing. First, let me say that what Epstein did, and all of those criminals who took advantage of those girls that were being sex trafficked by Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, are monsters, and every single one of them has to be held accountable. But as horrible as it was, what is being done to the people of Gaza today is even worse. They're actually, it's horrible enough to sexually abuse young girls, but to murder them, starve them to death, terrorize them, orphan them, force them to undergo amputations without anesthetic. So as important as the whole question of what Jeffrey Epstein did, who else who committed crimes, whether this was being used as compromat to control people in positions of power in the West, as important as that question is, we can't take our eye off the ball. Right now, the number one focus should be the Holocaust in Gaza. And I've had this uneasy feeling, Leon, sometimes when I'm watching this coverage, even in well-meaning people in the alternative media who have been so focused, understandably, on Trump's refusal to release the Epstein files over the last couple of weeks. They need to keep their eye on the ball. We have to stop this genocide. That is the number one priority. We can take care of justice for the victims of Epstein's crimes a little bit down the road. That can wait a little bit. Right now, let's stop the genocide. And I get this uneasy feeling that in some weird, perverse sort of way, Israel, which probably had recruited Epstein as a Mossad agent, is benefiting from the fact that there's so much attention right now being given to Epstein.
And the other thing to that point is, because I was just asked this question earlier today, and my response was, the Epstein discussion is nothing more than a distraction, which, to your point, is not to minimize the impact on the victims, but the plight of the victims of Epstein aren't being discussed by MSNBC and CNN. Yeah. That is wrong. The fact that Victoria, what's her name? The journalist. I'm sorry.
You're talking about the State Department official Victoria Nuland, or
no, the Daily Beast journalist who published the story that Acosta had been told to leave Epstein alone because he's intelligence. Victoria May, I think her name might be, and she has stuck to her story to this day. The fact that that element of the reality isn't being discussed by MSNBC and CNN, that tells you the story right now is a distraction, and we need to move away from the distraction and focus on the reality of the genocide in Gaza.
100%. And what the media, this is just driving me damn crazy. What the media are focusing on, the corporate media, is not, as you indicated, it's not whether this was all being done at the behest of Israel in order to. What it is how is this dividing MAGA? That's the whole story, right? Oh, look, Donald's supporters are turning against him en masse. This is, the Trump administration is in serious trouble. What the story should be is that we in the West have been fomenting, perpetrating, facilitating apartheid and genocide for decades, and right now there is a Holocaust happening in Gaza. That's what the story should be. And the only relevance Epstein has to all of that is how did Epstein's machinations and crimes facilitate Israel's ability to do what it is doing now? The fact that it's dividing the MAGA base is a distant third or fourth in terms of stories that ought to be talked about at this stage. But that's what they're all focused upon, So it's quite troubling to see this.
There's a piece at the Electronic Intifada entitled "The Dreams We Carry During Genocide." It's by Assem Al-Nabi. Assem Al-Nabi. And I'm going to read a little bit of this because I think it is incredibly telling in its simplicity. Quote, "I'm not sure if I made a mistake promising my nieces and nephews something sweet in the middle of a famine. I searched Gaza City for days before I finally found a single bar of chocolate, hidden like a treasure in the ruins of this old city. I paid an outrageous price and brought it back, breaking it into 7 tiny pieces for the children, giving none to the adults. As each child took a piece, I imagined its sweetness on my tongue, wishing there had been more for the kids. A few minutes later, my beautiful 5-year-old niece Lana said quietly, 'Uncle Assem, do you know my dream?' I answered with curiosity, 'Please tell me, Lana.' 'My dream is to have a whole bar of chocolate,' Lana said. For a moment, I couldn't respond. How has chocolate become a dream for a child in the 21st century? Why is it impossible to grant even this small wish?" For as simple as that is, I think it's incredibly telling. Dimitri, your thoughts?
As I was listening to you, I just was thinking that I feel as a human being that I've been scarred by this experience.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that there are billions of people around the world who are being scarred by this experience. When you hear the words of this little girl, that so many children in the world, they take for granted that they can have a whole chocolate bar, more than whole chocolate bar. All they have to do is ask their parents, and this little girl is dreaming of a chocolate bar. And all of this is preventable. All of this is being facilitated by our governments. Without their complicity, this couldn't be done. It's a soul-crushing thing to watch, and I don't think the world will ever be the same, ever. Israel will never, ever recover from this reputationally. The United States, Canada, France, Britain will never recover from this reputationally because of the terrible stories of this little girl.
And there's another piece in Consortium News, and the Hague Group confronts Israel over Gaza. The U.S. is now expected to pressure other countries not to sign the joint action. We've got about 5 minutes. Your thoughts?
Yeah, the Hague Group, first of all, let me commend the 12 states, as I understand it, all of which come from the Global South. So, again, another black mark on the standing of the West in the world. Not one Western country joined with those states in adopting collectively a series of measures, probably the most important of which is an arms embargo on Israel. And that means not only not selling weapons to Israel, but not buying weapons from Israel. So it's
wait a minute. Quickly to that point, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez defends her decision to support military aid for Israel.
Well, if that doesn't discredit her forever, I don't know what will. This is a progressive. If that's what a progressive is, I want nothing to do with progressivism. I'm done with progressivism. She has shown herself to be a Nancy Pelosi in waiting.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's what she secretly aspires to be one day. She's completely discredited herself. And at the end of the day, the fact that no Western country, including the United States, and did she talk about the United States signing on to the resolution of the Hague Group? Of course not. She's opposed to it, apparently. But she's going to be cast on the trash heap of history very soon. And what's going to be left are people of conscience and governments of conscience who did what the Hague Group did. They will be remembered honorably. And I must say, though, Wilmer, that there were actually 30 states that participated in that summit, which happened on July 15th and 16th, and only 12 signed on. I'm disappointed by the fact that China didn't sign on. Now, maybe they plan to do that. They can always join on to that statement, in the days and weeks ahead. Mm-hmm. But China is one of the largest trading partners of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Indonesia was at that conference, a huge country I think it might be the most populous, predominantly Muslim country in the world. Why didn't they sign on to the statement? I believe Egypt was there. Qatar was there. Turkey was there. Erdogan constantly spewing invective at Israel's genocidal regime, while at the same time his country allows oil to be transited through Turkey to Israel. So in a way, this sort of separated, the wheat from the chaff, the Hague Group Summit. We found out who's serious and who ain't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we in the Palestinian Solidarity Movement need to be calling out the participants in that summit who didn't even have the decency to sign on to that statement. By the way, that statement is not particularly aggressive. They didn't call the 12 signatories for a complete cessation of all trade with Israel, a complete trade embargo.
Mm-hmm.
They limited it to arms. Okay, they had a few other measures in there, but it would have been entirely reasonable for them to say our countries are going to cut off all economic transactions with Israel and all diplomatic relations. They didn't go that far, and still there were these 18 other countries who participated in the summit but who didn't sign on to the statement. That's disappointing.
My parents taught me very early to understand the one thing about right is that it's always right, and that you do what's right because it's right, and the rest over time will take care of itself. And so to your point, where's China on this? Woefully missing here. And not that in and of itself would have made a difference in the statement, because what's going on is going to go on. But you do what's right because it's right. Other trade relations be damned. You do what's right because no matter what interest China believes it's protecting, it pales in comparison to genocide.
100%. And, and the thing is, Wilmer, the amount of trade that between China and Israel, it's a significant amount of money for Israel, but it's peanuts for China. So it's like, China could have cut off all economic relations with Israel and it wouldn't have had even a pipsqueak of an impact on the Chinese economy. It's so huge. So what is the justification here? I don't understand this is an opportunity for the People's Republic of China to emerge not only as an economic leader, but as a moral leader. Why are they not seizing that opportunity? They could win billions of enthusiastic fans all around the world, including in the West. How many people in the West would be standing up and applauding China if it took the lead in using its economic leverage to try to put a stop to this genocide? Even if it wasn't successful, the attempt itself would earn huge amount of admiration for China. I don't understand what they're thinking.
Dimitri Lascaris, thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate that analysis. And as always, look forward to having you back.
Thank you, Wilmer. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Again, Dimitri, thank you, folks. Thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned. New episode tomorrow. And who's my guest tomorrow? Oh, I believe Ajamu Baraka is going to be joining us tomorrow. Stay tuned. New episodes every day. Follow, subscribe, leave a review, share the show, follow on social media. All the links are below. Remember, this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. Why? Because it's rhetoric free. See y'all tomorrow. Until then, I am Wilmer Leon. Have a wonderful remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.